Welcome at Room for Discussion. My name is Ivana Mitus, and my colleague is Jasper van Dijk. And the man that is sitting behind me in our Chesterfield was probably completely unknown for most of us just 1 year ago. But after he published his book that is standing here, the world could not stop talking about him, his work, and his main topic, wealth inequality. We are very happy that he is here today with us to discuss his findings with us, students economics. You can join the conversation on Twitter using #RFD, or if you're a student and you want to ask a question, you can go up to Donald. For now, I would like to ask a big round of applause for Mr. Thomas Piketty.
Welcome, Mr. Piketty. Thank you very much for coming. I think we never had so many people in this room before. And yesterday, you sold out a place where normally Prince, Nirvana, Pink Floyd, and many other rock stars performed. How did you pull it off as an economist to sell out Paradiso?
This was very interesting experience. Thanks for inviting me. I'm very glad that my book is now available in the Netherlands. So sorry that my English sounds a lot like French, and I hope, I hope this will be possible for you to understand me. I'm very glad that this book is having such a broad audience. This is. I tried hard to make it a readable, accessible, non-technical history of wealth and money. And, I think the success of the book shows that these are issues that are too important to be left to a small group of economists or statisticians. And so, yes, the publicity that comes with the success of the book, is okay, as long as it gets more people to read the book and I have no problem with this. And yesterday night was a lot of fun. That was very nice.
Well, your book changed the lives of many people, but also yours. And how did it change your life?
Well, not so much. This is it's a bit special when I am on the book tour, but the rest of the time I have a pretty normal life, and I just live like another academic, in Paris, and I have a very normal life with my children in Paris, and yes, it's doesn't make such a big difference.
All right, let's talk about your book. That's why we are all here. Probably not everyone has read the whole book. Which is almost as big as the one over there. So let me try to summarize it very briefly, and please correct me if I'm wrong. You collected a lot of data of the last 250 years on capital and income and wealth. And in your analysis, you find that the return on capital is larger than economic growth. It's your equation R larger than G. And therefore, inequality is rising. And you propose a tax on capital to decrease inequality, right?
Yeah, well, R bigger than G does not imply that inequality will rise forever. It just implies that inequality will reach maybe higher levels than what we really need for economic efficiency and growth. And indeed, one way to limit the impact of this is to have a progressive tax system on wealth, inheritance, income. But this is not the only way. I should say that the primary, there are different mechanisms that play an important role in the history of inequalities that I describe in my book. I look at over 20 countries across 3 centuries, so it couldn't be that everything can be explained just by R bigger than G. So in particular, education, educational institutions can be a powerful way to reduce inequality, and probably, in the future, that's the most important thing, in particular in Europe, is to invest more in universities, to invest more in higher education. And, I'm not saying that because I am in a university. I'm saying that because, right now in Europe, we have youth unemployment is extremely large, particularly in Southern Europe, and it means that a very large fraction of the young generation start in life with no professional experience and sometimes insufficient training, and this is really the most worrying aspect of the current situation for me, and we are putting far too little money into education and university funding in Europe. So there are different policies that matter. Progressive taxation can be important, education, minimum wages, there's a whole set of policy that can help to regulate capitalism in the common interest.
Yeah, but go back to your book. You collected a lot of data for your book, but also for a lot of countries there wasn't any data available. For example, for Russia and for a lot of emerging economies. But do you think the data you have is enough to draw conclusions on a global scale?
Well, yeah, we still know too little. We know a bit more than we used to. So
yeah.
that's progress. That's good, but we still know too little. And yeah, we need to collect more data. One good thing about with the publication of the book is that in many countries, governments are now ready to open fiscal data that they didn't want to open before.
Yep.
So there are new countries like Korea or Mexico or Brazil, not Russia yet, I should say, but at least these three countries which are now in the World Top Income database and that were not in the database when I wrote the book, so which now could be included in the book.
And what data should they collect precisely, the countries you don't have any data of?
So, there are different data sources to study inequality. So household surveys are useful. Now the problem with household surveys is that they only rely on reported, self-reported data. So in general, in order to have more information on distribution of income and wealth, you really want to have administrative fiscal data. Yeah. And so it's important to understand that progressive taxation taxation is more than taxation. It's also a way to produce information about society. And if we didn't have a progressive income tax, we would have much less information about income than we have. And it is the same for wealth. And I think, one reason why it will be important to have a progressive wealth tax, even with very low tax rates to begin with in a country like the Netherlands, is that this will be a way to produce more information about how the different wealth groups are doing in society. And I think, my main conclusion at the end is really this. We need more transparency about income and wealth dynamics so that we better know where our societies are going. Look, in the Netherlands, there was this report that came out yesterday or 2 days ago about the top 500 fortunes in the Netherlands. And I am sure that this is a very good magazine, but I think it's a bit sad that people have to buy magazine to know about wealth. It would be better if we could read, Eurostat publication or official publication of the Statistical Institute in the Netherlands. But for this, we need automatic transmission of information about cross-border assets in Europe. We need progressive taxation of wealth so that publicly available, reliable information is collected. So, of course, governments, I can see why in Russia the governments, are worried about publicly available information, and they prefer to deal with their oligarchs in their own way. They keep them as long as they don't do politics. They put them in jail. That's one way to regulate inequality. But I think, in the Netherlands, in Europe, we would like to have, more transparency, and we should not be afraid of transparency about wealth and income.
But clearly, we don't have data on all the countries. But is it still possible then to draw a global conclusion?
Oh, that's difficult. And look, I don't claim I am able to, I am much better at analyzing the past than the future. Let me be very clear about that. And, ultimately, the objective of my book is not to say, okay, this is what will happen, this is what you should believe. My objective is to help people to, write their own conclusion and their own part 4 about the future. So I have my own part 4 of the book where I try to derive some conclusions, but I don't ask people to agree with all of my conclusions. I present the conclusions which are strike me as the most reasonable one given the evidence that we have, but we still know too little, and ultimately, I talk about making Europe more democratic, and we need more democracy, but democracy begins with the democratization of knowledge, and what I really want to contribute to is to make knowledge about the economy, about income and wealth more accessible, and then there will be more data in the future, there will be more controversies, there will be, and that's perfectly fine.
And while analyzing this data from the past, where you are better in, you say, when was the eureka moment that you thought, R is larger than G?
I think when you think about it, sometimes there are things which are sort of obvious afterwards, and indeed it took me a long time to get to this conclusion. But retrospectively, I think at the time of Balzac or Jane Austen, it was obvious to everybody that R was bigger than G. So they would not formulate it this way. But it was really obvious for a simple reason, which is that the G was close to zero. The growth rate was very small in pretty much every society until the Industrial Revolution. And the rate of return to capital, of course, was not zero. Every reader of Jane Austen or Balzac knows that the rate of return is typically 5% per year. So
so you're saying R is larger than G, and in the past that was the case, but you also think the next 100 years R would also be larger than G, and that will cause inequality. But why are you so sure that R would be larger than G in the upcoming 100 years?
Well, so if we come back through history to begin with, it's important to see that the modern industrial revolution, already in the 19th century, of course, increased the growth rate to 1 to 2% per year, but at the same time, the rate of return to capital also increased to from 5 to 6, 7% for modern industrial investment, and the long run rate of return on the stock market is typically 6 to 7% or even more in most countries. Now, growth rates are never 5% or 6% forever. We had growth rate of 5% per year in the post-war decades in the Netherlands or in France or in Germany. But this didn't last forever, and what historical experience suggests is that you cannot have growth rate that high forever.
We didn't expect our technical revolution that in 1980s with the growth rates of 5%, but maybe that will happen again in the 21st century, and we have
sure.
And then G will be larger than R, and then we won't be any inequality.
And I will be very happy. I'm just saying that we should not bet on that. I'm just saying that we should have a plan B, in case this does not happen. So, and if this happens, if we have growth rate of 5% again, I will be very happy, and then we won't need to worry about R bigger than G. I'm just saying that it would be a mistake just to wait for growth of 5% per year to start all over again. I think it's important to realize that first, there's no logical reason at all why R and G should be the same. No economic theory, no economic model, no economic reasoning of any sort predicts that they should be the same. Okay? And it's important also to realize that a growth rate of 1 or 1.5% per year for per capita GDP in the long run is already very high. It means that every generation, every 30 years, you have about 1/3 to 1/2 of the economy that is being renewed. Look, 30 years ago, the world was very different, and the growth rate in the past 30 years in rich countries was only 1.5% in per capita term, and still that was enough to change a lot the structure of the economy. So, with a 1.5% growth rate per year, you already need to invest a lot in education to make sure that everybody finds a job. So, just waiting for growth to go up to 5%.
Okay, so that's the growth, that will be low, and then you have the R on the other side, and so you have national income, and capital income will increase with R, and will be way larger, but I would think, if I look at economic-wise, that so the supply of capital will increase, so wouldn't that mean that the return on capital will decrease, and so we'll go closer to G?
Right, but remember that let's take a very simple example. You know, assume the return is 5%, the growth rate is 1%. You know, what will happen, what this means is that on average, people can consume, you know, for most of the return. They can consume the 4/5 of the return, and they only need to reinvest 1/5 of the return in order to ensure that their wealth will grow as fast as the size of the economy. So this is why, you know, R bigger than G does not imply that capital will rise faster than income forever. That does not imply that inequality will rise forever. It simply implies that the very large inequality of wealth will be able to sustain forever. So R bigger than G does not imply infinite inequality. It just implies very high inequality and very limited mobility. And the bigger the gap between R and G, and the more inequality and the less mobility in the long run. Now, you know, I certainly don't claim I know for sure what the future rate of return is going to be, but if you look at the most recent data, you know, it looks as if financial deregulation has certainly increased the inequality in rate of returns that are accessible to different people. So, you know, if you have very large financial portfolio, you are able to access very sophisticated financial products that deliver high return. Whereas if you just have, you know, 10,000 euros or 100,000 euros, the rate of return you get can be very small. So even if the gap between the average rate of return and the growth rate is not very large, the inequality in rate of return can imply that for large wealth levels, the gap is much
So
bigger.
if you're already really rich, have a lot of capital, it's easier to get a high rate of return than if you don't have a lot of capital.
Right. So in the book, I give some data about university endowments in the US. So that's an interesting case. I don't do that to depress you at the University of Amsterdam. You know, I don't know whether you have a capital endowment, and I don't, maybe not, or probably not as big as Harvard. But you know, the reason I use this data on university endowments is because there is very good, reliable data on what they do with their money. Whereas the Forbes people, you know, we don't really know what they do. So the numbers are quite impressive in the Forbes ranking, or actually in the rankings of fortunes in the Netherlands. You know, it looks as if the top wealth groups are doing much better than average, but we don't really know where this comes from. With the university endowments, we have very good data, and what we find is the following. If you look at the period from 1980 to 2010, and you look at the 800 US universities with capital endowments, you know, the higher the initial endowment, the higher the rate of return. And if you take the biggest endowments, like, you know, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, you know, they have rate of return in real terms above inflation after all administrative costs of 8, 9, 10% per year over this 30-year period, whereas the smaller universities have, you know, less than 5%. That's a very powerful force. That's a lot more than the gift that are made, you know, by former students. You know, sometimes in the US we talk a lot about the fact that, you know, billionaires are very generous and give all their money away. Let me just give you one number. Again, taken from Harvard University accounts, you know, which are publicly available data, you know, very easy to check. The rate of return on their endowment was, on average, you know, over 9% per year between 1980 and 2010. The gift that were made by the former students of Harvard were less than 0.5% of the endowment per year. So this does not matter, you know, as compared to the rate of return effect and the pure capitalization effect. So, but I think people don't have this in mind very well, and that's important to look at the data to see it.
Okay, thank you. I think we have a question from the audience.
Yes, first question.
Yeah, if we can go back to economic policy. Is capital and income inequality higher in cities? And what does this mean for policy on local level?
Higher in cities, yeah, it's you know, it's a complicated question. You know, I don't have a general answer to this. I think in some cases it is higher in cities. You know, in general, if you want to have an impact on wealth inequality, I think it is better to have policy at a relatively broad level, national or supranational or even European level. If you do it at a sort of very local level, of course, the forces of tax competition and to try to attract the wealthiest taxpayers makes it very difficult to have an impact.
Thank you for your question. I have some statistic from Forbes. You just referred to Forbes already. And that is a list of the wealthiest Americans in 1982 and in 2012. And what they found is that less than 1/10 of the people from 1982 are still on the list in 2012, even if they had accumulated their wealth by 4%. And what I was wondering is, this is actually saying that the rich don't necessarily stay rich, and isn't income inequality a much bigger problem?
Well, I think both are important. Look, in the book, I talk both about the history of income and wealth inequality, and both are very important. So you do have wealth mobility at the top. You're perfectly right, and that's even more true at the world level. I use in my book the global billionaire rankings published by Forbes between 1987 and 2013, and at the top of the list in 1987, you have Japanese billionaires that everybody has forgotten, and at the end of the period, you have people from Mexico and China, and you have new billionaires. So you have a lot of mobility. You're perfectly right. But even if you have a lot of mobility, some people will go down, some people will go up. In principle, on average, the average wealth of this top group of people should rise more or less at the same speed as the size of the world economy, at the same speed as average wealth. The problem is that this is not at all what we observe. So, according to these Forbes rankings, if you take the average wealth of a fixed fraction of the world population over this time period, these are not the same people. You have the mobility you just referred to. But, in principle, the average wealth of this group should grow at the same speed as average growth in the world, which for average wealth has been about 2% per year over this time period. Now, in fact, according to Forbes, they have grown at between 6 and 7% per year, so 3 to 4 times faster than the average. Now, this cannot continue forever. It's good to have entrepreneurs, it's good to have innovators, but, you want the different groups in society to grow at speed which are compatible with one another. You cannot have, a group in society that grow forever 3-4 times faster than the size of the economy. So this is what I'm concerned with, and I think everybody should be concerned with, including the billionaires. If we want to continue with globalization, it's important that everybody benefits from globalization in proportions that are roughly comparable. In addition, keep in mind that this Forbes ranking, I think, probably overestimate entrepreneurs for a simple reason, which is that they are much easier to spot. If you have made your fortune in a new business, it's impossible to miss you. If I have founded Microsoft or Facebook, you are very easy to. In fact, you want to be known. Whereas when you have large inherited wealth and a very large diversified portfolios, it's very difficult to spot you. So this is why magazines are very nice, data sources. But it will be better to have more systematic data sources on wealth. And when we have these data sources like inheritance tax returns, we observe a lot less mobility than what we have in the Forbes ranking. So, it's
And so you're saying R is larger than G, and that will cause inequality. And you say this is basically inherent to capitalism. It's a problem in capitalism. But if it's a problem in capitalism, shouldn't we switch to another system? Is capitalism the right system?
Well, I think we need private property for incentives, and the countries that have tried to abolish private property, of course, have not been very successful. So we need to find other ways to go beyond, the extreme concentration of private properties that you can have under laissez-faire capitalism. So the progressive wealth tax is a way, to keep the private property system, and at the same time, in a way, you make private property temporary, because by having very high tax rate and very high property levels, it's as if you had a permanent land reform. You have a permanent revolution that sort of shakes the distribution. There are other ways to go beyond private property. I think, if you look at the property structure for this university or for media groups or for institutions, I think nobody would like to transform Harvard University into a shareholder company where no, but look, in the US, some people have tried to have to transform universities into shareholder companies. Some people believe we can organize everything as shareholder companies, but I think there are different ways to organize property, to have alternative governance system. New technologies can help to develop, new forms of participatory governance and participatory financing, crowdfunding. So, the story of property is not over yet. There are new forms of property to invent in the future. And, we should not believe that there's just one way to organize economic activity and property relationship.
We have another student question.
Right. Hi. I must confess I'm not an economist. By training, I'm an anthropologist, and my name is Hassan Ashraf. And my question is to you that the capital accumulation in different Western European countries, largely depending on creating inequalities and exploiting labor and resources in some other places. To be particular, if you look at the transnational textile production, that, for example, France, Netherlands, or Germany, they're largely depending on producing the mass consumption items like clothes in a country like Bangladesh. So what is your opinion on this, that how progressive taxation can end inequality that is creating in some other places, like in Bangladesh, Cambodia, India, Pakistan?
Right. So international inequality is probably, one of the most violent forms of inequality. And in my book, I try to put this issue of international inequality in perspective. And in particular, I look a lot at the colonial period, where in effect, France, Britain, the Netherlands were owning a big part of the rest of the world, and were receiving capital income, rent, dividend, interest from the rest of the world. And it's important to remember that, this was a very important part of capitalist development, in the West. And, up until World War I, countries like France or Britain, in fact, had a permanent trade deficit with respect to the rest of the world. The rest of the world was working for them. And this was fine because they were receiving capital income from the rest of the world that was much bigger than their trade deficit, so they were able not only to pay for their deficit, but to keep buying the rest of the world. So it's as if you pay rent to the owner of your apartment, and with the money, the owner is buying the rest of the building. So this is, it's always complicated to pay rent to your owner, but when it's paying rent to another country, this is even more complicated. And of course, at that time, this came with political domination and colonialism. So now, today, I think it will be a mistake to believe that this only belongs to the past. And, we still have today the situation of entire countries, including in Africa, of course, where national income is a lot less than domestic output, because a big part of domestic output goes abroad. And when we talk about aid, development aid to these countries, these are much smaller flows than the outgoing flows to the owners of the capital stock. So, these issues of international inequality, of course, cannot be solved simply through, progressive taxation. Unless, if we had a world political community with a world progressive wealth tax, this will be a way to redistribute, capital at the world level. But in practice, given that, we have national governments, we can try to make them bigger, like in Europe instead of the Netherlands or France, but still this will not be the entire world, at least not in the foreseeable future. So there are other policies that are very important. And of course, migration policy It's another way to sort of redistribute also the opportunities, if you cannot redistribute the capital, you can redistribute the labor, or at least let people move more easily than they do. There are many other policy options that can play an important role, but yes, in any case, let me mention that financial transparency is something that will bring benefit not only to northern countries like the Netherlands, but even more so to countries in the south. Countries in Africa, in Latin America are suffering a lot from capital flight and from the lack of automatic transmission of information about cross-border financial assets, and they could benefit enormously from the kind of financial transparency reforms that I call for in my book.
Well, maybe we could compare the international development aid with national development aid, because transferring money from the rich to the poor is something that you also propose by imposing a top-level capital tax. And what some people say is that you're missing the point, because just transferring money to the poor doesn't make the process of our society more equal, and it's only sort of fighting the consequences of inequality instead of really solving it. What do you think of that?
Well, I think to address inequality in the first place, you need to invest in skills, you need to invest in education, you need to invest in health. This is the way to affect the pre-distribution, if you want, of inequality. But in order to finance this investment in education, in health, you need tax revenues, and also you need people to agree on a tax system. And I think it's very difficult to ask, the middle class and the poor to keep paying for these public services if at the same time, the top wealth people or top income people or large multinational corporations are not paying tax anymore. So I think the biggest threat to our social model, in Europe, but also in other parts of the world, is that, you need fiscal justice also if you want to maintain the fiscal consent, of the broad population to pay for these primary goods and these fundamental goods, such as access to education, access to health, which indeed are the primary way to reduce inequality much more than taxation in itself. So taxation is useful mostly through the social services that it allows to finance.
So actually your proposal of the capital tax is a way to finance giving equal opportunities and fight poverty, and to collect more data on wealth. Is that right, what you said?
Yeah, collect more data. It's not for the sake of having more data to do nice PhD theses.
I said it as a second reason.
It's also, if you want to do financial regulation, when you have a banking crisis, there was this banking crisis in Cyprus last year. So it was only Cyprus, so it was not too bad. But if it happens again with a bigger financial center in Europe than Cyprus, we will have big problems. Because what we had at that time is that, the IMF and the European Central Bank were telling us, okay, we don't want to use European taxpayer money to bail out for the banks in Cyprus because there are big Russian oligarchs that have money in Cyprus. And they were probably right. Now, the only problem is that, in fact, they had no data whatsoever, the people at the IMF and the European Central Bank on these oligarchs. So at the end of the day, they came with this very bad solution, which was a flat tax on all deposits in Cyprus. Whether you have 10,000 euros or 10 million euros, you will pay the same flat tax. And people, went crazy. This was adopted unanimously by the Council of Finance Minister, including the finance minister from the Netherlands, I guess, who was heading the council. But, they were all responsible. It was a unanimity decision. Well, this is the kind of unanimity decision where the next day everybody is saying, this is not my fault. This is the way we govern Europe. We take a unanimity decision and then nobody is responsible. But anyway, this is why we need more transparency. If we want to regulate financial crises and distribute the burden of adjustment and the cost of adjustment in a way that is acceptable, we need to know who owns what in what countries. Look, in my country, in France, the budget minister, Cahuzac, had a bank account in Switzerland, and, the president of France was not even aware of that. And the budget minister, who was in charge of collecting taxation in France, had a bank account in Switzerland, and he thought that he could do away with it forever. This is crazy. And we had to wait for US sanctions against Swiss banks in order to make a little bit of progress in the direction of automatic transmission of bank information in Europe. We should have been able to solve the problem by ourselves because, the Netherlands, France, Germany, Italy are much more, concerned in a way by, having tax haven in the middle of Europe. So, we are asking the Greeks to improve their tax system and to make wealthy Greek citizens pay more tax, and this is a very reasonable demand, but at the same time, we let wealthy Greek taxpayers transfer their money to banks in France or Germany or the Netherlands without transmitting the information to the Greek tax administration. So how do you want them to have a... So, we are in a complete contradiction. So we need transparency, because this is the only way to get to a tax system that is, just more efficient and acceptable by the entire population.
Okay. Yeah, I want to go to the audience.
Yes, question on innovation.
Yes, hello. You, of course, are economist, and a lot of what you say is very economic. And my question is about when you talk about these economic policy developments and innovations, who do you think should lead the way? Because economics does not, even though some economists might think so, it does not operate in a vacuum. Do you think there's a bigger role for economics or for politics?
Well, I view myself more as a social scientist than as an economist. I think the boundaries between economics and history and sociology and anthropology and political science, are not as clear as what economists sometimes try to pretend. Economists, like to believe that they have a science that is, much more advanced than the other social sciences, but of course this is a big joke. But so I think economists have a big responsibility in pretending that they have a science that of course they don't have. But non-economists have also a big responsibility for letting them do that. It's very easy for non-economists, to say, okay, I don't know anything about economics, but I think economic issues, are of interest to everyone, and we should not let others, decide, what we should think about economic issues, and so it's very important. That these disciplinary boundaries be overcome, and that economists need to make effort, of course, to collect more data and do less, they do less sophisticated mathematical model to try to pretend that they are very scientific, but without really dealing with important facts and important data collection. But other fields and the rest of society in general should not let them do that either.
Well, back on your proposal, you just say we should have more international cooperation and financial transparency, but at this moment, we still need the US to give up Swiss bank secrecy. And then you say, well, maybe we should just start in Europe with a common wealth tax. And why Europe?
Oh, I'm just saying Europe because I happen to be European, but I will be. Look, I will be in China next week, and I will say the same. So. Actually, in China right now they are having a very serious discussion about introducing a wealth tax, and in particular, tax on inherited wealth. Which, so far in China, there was no tax at all on inheritance. So they have an income tax, but they don't have a tax on inheritance. And they will probably introduce one in the coming months or years. So far, the Chinese way of dealing with inequality has been more, sort of case-by-case basis. So it's more you have this big anti-corruption campaign, which is, a little bit the Russian way of dealing with oligarchs. You let some people get very rich, and then suddenly, when you decide that it's too much, you put them in jail. Which is, but many people, including in the Chinese Communist Party, are starting to realize that this is not a very efficient way to deal with wealth accumulation and wealth distribution. So they are, I think they will introduce different forms of property tax or wealth tax in the future. This is particularly important there, maybe even more than in Europe, because with the declining population, inherited wealth is playing a bigger and bigger role in China. When you have, in a society with very fast population growth, inheritance does not really matter. But in society where...
Because Chinese only have one child.
Yeah, when you have only one child, it means that you inherit from both sides or from zero side if both parents are poor. So in very concrete terms, this means that, people who come from the countryside in China and want to access property in Shanghai or Beijing, it's even harder than in Paris or London. So these issues that we talk about in Europe of, how can you access property only with your labor income as a, for the young generation in Europe, in China, I can tell you that they have the same issues, and in many ways it's even stronger. And, maybe in 2030, inheritance in China will be even more important than at the time of Balzac in Paris, So they are very concerned about this, and so, yeah, I talk more about Europe because, I feel a bit more, concerned about the European evolutions, but,
Don't you think that it would harm the European economy if we would start in Europe, because we already have some troubles with economic growth, instead of, China doesn't have that, but we do, so wouldn't that be a problem?
I think the consequence of the tax competition between European countries is that we tax less and less large corporations, very high wealth holders, but then in order to compensate for this, we tax more and more our European taxpayers that cannot move. So typically low skill and medium skill labor is taxed very heavily in Europe, and that's not good for growth, that's not good for job creation. So at the end of the day, I think in a time period where private wealth in Europe relative to GDP has increased a lot, in fact, a lot more than the increase in public debt relative to GDP, which is in a way good news. We are rich, and private wealth, in relative to GDP is higher in Europe than it has ever been for an entire century. But, it is just common sense when private wealth is so high relative to GDP to tax labor income a bit less and wealth a bit more. It's a question of common sense, and that would be good not only for equity, but also for efficiency. A big part of Europe's unemployment problem comes from our very heavy taxation of labor income, very high payroll tax. I can tell you in France or in Belgium, and maybe a bit less so in the Netherlands, although I'm not sure. The level of payroll taxation and labor taxation in Europe is very bad for job creation.
But to implement this in Europe, we need a fiscal union, because otherwise you cannot put the same taxes globally on the whole continent. But as we see, it's not really easy to create a fiscal union in the Eurozone. So why do you think this will happen?
No, nothing is easy, but it's not easy to have a common currency either. So everything that we try to do with 18 countries or 28 countries and 500 million people rather than 20 or 30 or 60, is complicated. But I think at some point we have to choose what we want. I think it's very difficult to have a common currency with 18 different public debt, 18 different interest rates, 18 different tax systems in competition with one another. And, this is a system that's not working and that will never work. And this is why we have today this big confidence crisis in Europe. We have, the crisis initially came from America and came from the private banking sector in America. And we've managed, because of our bad institutions in Europe, to transform it into a public debt crisis in Europe, although the overall level of the public debt initially was not higher in Europe than in the US or than in the UK. And now the US and the UK have a much bigger growth rate than we have in the Eurozone. And even in Germany, the growth rate is much less good than in Britain, which is outside the Eurozone. So how long are we going to wait before we realize that the way we've been dealing with the Eurozone crisis is not adequate? And my own belief is that as long as we have 18 different public debt and interest rate and corporate tax, this will not work. And I can tell you, when you travel to other parts of the world, this is sort of obvious to everybody. In the US, people tell you, well, look, if the Federal Reserve Bank in the US had to choose every morning between the public debt of California, the public debt of Texas, New York, with different interest rates, this will be a big mess, just like in Europe. And this is the monster that we have created. And so, we can keep saying that we just need to wait and do more austerity and that this will work better, but I don't think this will work
So
better.
that's what we can do in Europe. But now I want to zoom in to the Netherlands, because you're here, and yesterday, on invitation of Jesse Klaver, you went to the Dutch Parliament, and Jesse Klaver is of the left party, GroenLinks, and he proposed several things. And one was that real income out of capital larger than 1 million should be taxed by 50%. And this is part of a progressive tax on capital. But you propose a capital tax of 1% per year above 1 million globally. So he proposes to tax income out of capital, and you propose to tax the capital per year. But this is quite different, isn't it?
Yeah, you can do both.
It has the same effect.
Not exactly. So, taxing the return to capital and taxing the stock of capital are two things that are a bit different, but that can be complementary. And the reason is that by taxing sometimes the return to capital is difficult to observe. That's one reason. And sometimes also taxing the stock of capital can be a way to put more incentives for people to get a higher return. So, but at the same time, I think both are useful. So you have to find some balance on how much you tax the flow return to capital and how much you tax the stock. And in the same way, you have to find some balance on how much you tax at the time of inheritance and how much you tax during your entire lifetime. So, people tend to prefer to pay 1% wealth tax each year during 30 years and 30% at the time of inheritance. But maybe that's partly because of tax illusion, but I think it's also because at the time of inheritance, sometimes you don't have the money to pay the large tax, and also sometimes you don't know what the future rate of return to your inheritance will be. So I think you have to find a balance between these different tax instruments. You have the taxation of the income flow, annual taxation of the capital stock, and taxation of inherited wealth at the time of inheritance. And these three forms of taxation, are complementary rather than substitute.
But so the Netherlands, this is their plan, or this is the plan of the left, on the basis of your book. But maybe Germany will put another plan forward on the basis of your book. But if all countries in Europe will make their own plan out of it, wouldn't this harm your tax plan for the whole of Europe and globally, if everyone is doing something differently?
Yeah, well, I'm not saying that we should have just one tax system for every taxation. I think in Europe, this will be a step-by-step process. I think the most urgent tax instrument, to put in common in Europe is probably the corporate tax, because, the mobility of corporate profits is probably the biggest challenge right now. So, this is, I think, where we should start. Then for wealth taxation, I think at least for the largest wealth levels, on the highest income levels, it will be preferable also to do that in common. But let's start somewhere. The corporate tax would already be something. You can have different tax schedules for wealth or capital income, as long as you have automatic transmission of information on cross-border assets. This is already much easier to do, and we still don't have it. We talk about it a lot, but the problem in Europe is that we talk a lot, but we don't. we don't always take decisions. And you know, again, this U.S. law on the FACTA law, you know, is still in advance of what we have in Europe. You know, in Europe, we still don't have a new regulation on transmission of information that is really working.
We have a question. One question.
Okay.
First question.
Yeah. My name is Clary. I heard you mention youth and unemployment before, and this made me think because certain scholars state that because of technological advancement, few acquire large amount of money, and meanwhile more and more, mainly administrative employees are losing their jobs because of this. So assuming that educating more people could not be the sole answer, what do you think of a universal basic income?
Yeah, I think, you know, for a long time, at least, you know, labor and working and having a job, you know, will be, you know, sort of the key way to find a place in society and to socialize. And so we need, you know, to ensure that everybody can find a job. So, you know, basic income can be a, you know, useful complement to our social system, but, you know, this should not be viewed as an alternative to employment. So, you know, you maybe you remember you know, Amazon made this announcement at the end of last year that they wanted to replace their delivery workers by drones. And, you know, many people initially thought that it was a joke, but in fact this was a very serious announcement. And, you know, other people said, you know, they are already treating their workers like drones, so, you know, after all, you know, maybe we should just accept this kind of evolution. And, you know, yeah, maybe in the long run, you know, it can be good if we can replace, you know, sort of manual work, tedious manual work by drones and machines. But then, you know, this raises at least two questions. You know, one, first is to ensure that, you know, everybody will find the skills and the education to find a job. And next, you know, who will own the drones? You know, who would be the ownership of the drones? So you know, of course, if everybody has an equal share in the stock of robots and the stock of drones, you know, this would be a way to pay for the basic income you are describing. But, you know, this is just saying that in a world where capital intensity will rise, where there will be more capital relative to output, the issue of who owns the capital and the distribution of wealth becomes increasingly important.
Second question.
I have two questions to you. The first one is concerning basically your proposal in the book for tackling the problem of inequality. You proposed the idea of introducing a progressive income tax of 80%. And I was wondering, how do you think this is going to affect economic activity? And don't you think that maybe a progressive consumption tax could be a solution?
Okay, so, you know, the question is it useful to pay top managers 10 million euros rather than 1 million euros? And do you have more job creation? Do you have better performance when you pay managers, you know, 10 million rather than 1 million? And, you know, I tried hard to find the effect in the data, but I couldn't find the extra performance and the extra job creation, you know. So it's you know, inequality, you know, of course you need to pay managers well, but above a certain level, you know, I don't think it is so useful. And you know, actually in the United States of America, between 1930 and 1980, on average, during this 50-year-long period, the top income tax rate applying to very high income, typically above $1 million, was 82%. And apparently, this did not destroy American capitalism. You know, I think the reason, and in fact, the growth rate at that time, you know, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, was higher in America, including the growth rate of productivity, than what it has been since the Reagan years. So, you know, it's a matter of degree. You know, if you put 80% on anybody that's making more than 100,000 euros, you know, probably that's not going to work. But, you know, 1 million, 5 million, 10 million, you know, is it useful to pay people that much? You know, the evidence is that it's not that it is not, it is not so useful. So I'm not sure it will harm the economy so much. Now, regarding the consumption tax, the progressive consumption tax rather than progressive income tax or wealth tax, it's interesting because I had this discussion and this proposal with Bill Gates recently wanted to have this Skype discussion with me because he wanted to write about my book. So I say, well, okay, let's have this discussion. And he told me, I like your idea about taxation and inequality, but I would prefer a progressive tax on consumption because a progressive tax on wealth, I don't feel it so much. And so, I told him, well, look, the problem is what is consumption, for very wealthy individuals? Because, when you're very wealthy, you cannot consume it on food or clothes or, the normal consumptions and you or me have. So when you're very wealthy, the way to consume, in a way, is by having influence, is by having power, So when you look at the Koch brothers, who are these very powerful billionaires in the US that are financing the Tea Party and the political campaigns, what are they doing when they are giving money to political campaigns? They are consuming. When you are very wealthy, you cannot just consume food. So you consume politicians, you consume academics, you consume journalists. You consume influence. The wealth is about power. This is consuming the time of other people, just like Bill Gates, who was consuming my time in this kind of conversation. But so this was only a 30-minute discussion, so this was okay. But it's so I can understand why he prefers progressive, taxation of consumption, because it will be a way not to pay tax on all the money that he's giving to his own foundation. But when you give money to a foundation of which you are the president and of which your wife and family members are members of the board, and is this really a disinterested gift? This is a way to keep power, which I understand that everybody prefers to keep power and to keep. That's a very human reaction, but. It's not possible to organize a society if everybody can decide for himself how much money he wants to give to the common good and health and education. So I'm afraid that I disagree with Bill Gates. And, I think a progressive taxation of wealth for very wealthy individuals is a better way, than progressive taxation of consumption.
Well, still on the progressive wealth tax, the difference, I think, between taxing income out of capital or capital is also that maybe the return on capital is fluctuating a lot. And for example, in the Netherlands, we have a tax on fictitious return on capital, because if the returns are fluctuating a lot, it's a pro-cyclical stimulus to our tax revenues, which is undesired. Do you think that it still doesn't matter whether you tax real income on capital or capital?
No, it does matter. But I'm just saying that there are costs and benefits to both. So that's why we need to do both and to find some middle ground. As you were saying, a very strong argument in favor of taxing the stock rather than the flow will be to say, you put... okay, there are two arguments. One for taxing the stock is to say you want to put incentives on people to get the highest possible return. But at the same time, the problem with this argument is that the return you get sometimes is just... it's not due only to your effort. It can just be a bad shock. So in the extreme case, if you just add a tax based on the stock, when a company is making loss, then the company would need to keep paying the same tax based on its capital stock than a company making profits. And that maybe the company is going to go bankrupt if you do that. So you need to find some balance on how much you tax the flow so as to insure companies and individuals against bad returns, and how much you tax the stock in order to put incentives to get high returns. So high return or low return are partly the consequences of individual action, effort, are partly the consequences of bad luck or good luck. So the optimum is in between. You know, there's an interior optimum where you want to tax a little bit the flow, a little bit the stock.
Okay. As I see here at the university, but also in bars, everyone is just discussing your book, and but not a lot of people have actually read it. I have the idea, but do you think there are a lot of people who didn't read your book and make your own truth out of it? And if is that a problem, you think?
Yeah, sometimes it can be a problem. Yeah,
Like when? When was the problem? When do you
well,
think?
you know, I don't have any specific example in mind, but you know, it's clear that, you know, with the success of the book, you know, sometimes, you know, everybody wants to write a paper about the book, you know, even without opening the book. So, you know, it's sometimes it gives a strange reviews, but you know, that's part of the success of the book. You know, I have no problem with it. You know, I feel that you still have a fair number of people who read it. You know, I receive lots of messages, and I see lots of people, you know, who tell me that, you know, they usually don't read that kind of big academic books, and that they've read it until the end, and that they understand everything. And, you know, even if it's a small fraction of everybody in this room, you know, that will still be a lot, and that will be enough to make me very happy. So.
Well, unfortunately, we're almost at the end of this interview. One last question. Where will you be in 20 years? Can we expect another book?
I think there will be other books before that. You know, I'm not gonna. I'm not gonna wait 20 years for another book. Yeah, in 20 years, you know, I will probably still be writing books, but you know, who knows? You know, I don't know. You know, it's. You know, I'm still young, so.
Still on the same topic?
I don't know. I don't know.
No idea.
You know, it could. No, I could move on to. You know, you know, the social sciences have, you know, there are lots of interesting research to do. You know, I love my work as an academic, as a teacher, and yeah, I don't know. I could move on to different topics. I don't know yet.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Before we end, I have a couple of announcements to make. Our next interview will be with Jet Bussemaker, the 26th of November. We will talk with her about the end of studiefinanciering. Second thing I want to say, we are looking for interviewers, so you think, I want to do this, I can do that. You can go to the SAFA website and apply. And the last thing I want to say is, Mr. Piketty here will stay here and will sign his book. And there will be 2 lines here on the left. One to buy the book, and the other one to get an autograph. Well, for the last time, big round of applause for Thomas Piketty.
Thank you. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
It was very interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you. Hello, thank you.
For the book sales,